Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Foresight webinar featuring new data and interviews with industry experts exploring the future of gender, including shifts in identity, expression, roles, and equality. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future. Matt, you have the floor.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future and your host for today's issue about the future of gender. So imagine it's 2020. Wait, no, this is What the Future, not What the Past. But wait a minute, the past year is going to provide some needed context because in March 2020, we dropped our first What the Future gender issue. You can see that in your downloads. And gender was timely then as it is now. The topic was in the spotlight in the thick of the Me Too era, and I flew to New York, had a lovely dinner on a rooftop in Manhattan with some coworkers. We prepped for our live event to launch this issue the next day. Then I woke up and I looked at Twitter and I realized that the world had changed. We wound up canceling the event the same day, and I hopped on a plane to get home as fast as I could. The world changed first with COVID-19 as the pandemic shifted people's attention. The world changed again in 2022 with the Supreme Court's Dobbs versus Jackson decision. That effectively reversed Roe v. Wade, redefining reproductive rights, and shifted the political landscape in 2022 and beyond. While our 2020 issue focused on changing definitions of gender, the 2023 issue finds us amid a sizable shift as states passed legislation aimed at solidifying gender as a binary that you're born and locked into, at least legally. That definition is one that most agree on today. Even the need for legislation is a fierce debate. We ask this in a couple of different ways, but overall, 53% of Americans agree that a person is either a man or a woman and nothing in between. 24% disagree. This is essentially unchanged since 2000. And while the long-term vectors of gender rights is toward equality and acceptance, trends don't always move in a straight line or in one direction. We acknowledged in 2020, but perhaps didn't lean hard enough into the potential for this shift, writing then that in an Ipsos survey of men, 31% said they feel excluded from the gender spectrum discussion, and a similar number are actively angered by the conversation, perhaps because 44% feel they will be attacked if they say what they're thinking. And a key stat we looked at in this issue provides a pretty big clue about what's going on. 71% of Republicans agree that gender being described as more than two genders or something outside of a male or female binary is changing too quickly. Just 29% of Democrats agree. This is a fraught landscape for brands to navigate in terms of their marketing and their products, and actually in their role as employers too, maybe even especially that. And fraught is a word you're going to hear me say a lot today. Again, we ask about this in a couple of different ways, and one thing that was true 3 years ago, and if anything seems more so today, America's youth and young adults have a very different idea about gender than older Americans. And perhaps because the conversation we wrote about then is ongoing, many plausible outcomes and scenarios exist. Of course, there's much more to say about gender than this cultural debate, but this isn't merely a cultural topic. How can brands navigate the politics and pronouns and purpose-driven conversations happening here? We get into several of those today. Now, some people think stereotypes are used to box people in, and some think that they are a rubric. Some see change as threatening or against their moral code, but some see the moral code itself as a threat. And that's why we chose this as our cover image. It's unclear what sex the child is. There are no cues. And in essence, every foresight project is an exercise in asking what kind of worlds might our children grow up in. Today, a sizable group think that gender is a fluid construct, not determined by your biology, even if a very small proportion actually identify their gender fluidity. A majority think that gender is a binary you're born into. And most people think that gender stereotypes in media are a problem, as is objectification and sexualization of women. Few think these problems will get better in our data. But as the tensions driving the future shifts, will things improve or worsen? For brands, every case is unique. every step features potential backlash and potential backlashes to the backlash. Backlash, whiplash, if you will. And to channel my inner Yoda, keep stepping, brands must, because even if you want the future to look more like the past, it won't be in the past. The future is always in the future. And it could look something like, well, everything we're going to talk about in this episode of WTF. We'll meet a digital filmmaker and storyteller using cutting-edge tools to drive empathy and understanding. You'll hear from a sports agent representing pro and collegiate women athletes about representation. We'll check in with the ANA's See Her project about representation in the media and advertising. And we'll talk to an economist about what's going on with dudes these days. Again, one word you're going to hear me use a lot today is fraught. This is a challenging topic, but we're up for it. So let's dive in. Now, as always, What the Future is born from the Ipsos theory of change, that there are three kind of different things that are going to impact the future and our trends and foresight work, and things that we consider when we're doing trends and foresight projects. The first is the macro forces, the huge seismic things shifting underneath us, sometimes very slowly, sometimes something happens that causes them to accelerate. But these are huge things like inequality and climate change, it's kind of tectonic plates underneath us. On the right-hand side, we think about the signals, the things we're seeing in the news today that give us some sense of where things might go tomorrow. We don't necessarily know what those things mean today, but our little futurist spidey sense tells us they might mean something, so we're going to keep an eye on them. And then finally, in the middle, we think about shifts. We think about the humans. We always think about the humans and how the forces around them are shifting society and their values and their behaviors. And we think about all of these things as we do either a trends foresight or a trends project or a foresight project or both. And trends and foresight are outcomes of all of this. We'll talk a little bit about how we use these in our modified WTF process, which we like to call editorial foresight, which is kind of a mini and tailored version of foresight itself. And one of the tools we use in traditional foresight is a domain map. And at that, the center is usually a business question, specifically related to a client and some issue facing their business. For editorial foresight, when we're doing a WTF, we need something a little broader. We need something that's going to appeal to a wide audience. And I gotta say, it works because I've seen the attendee list for this webinar. So welcome to my friends from CPG and energy and entertainment and automotive and financial services, and even a competitor or two. Welcome in. So when we're thinking about the future of gender, we're thinking about it from a lot of different perspectives and all of the different parts of this map that will shape the future of that topic. So we're thinking about the technology, and that's where we're going to talk to our digital storyteller, who's going to tell us about how he's using technology to promote understanding and empathy about gender roles. But we'll think about how technology plays in that space. We're going to be talking about all kinds of good stuff. We're going to be talking about identity and where gender fits into our identity. We'll talk about commercial representation and how that is shifting. And there we will speak to the sports agent, Erin Kane, who's going to talk about how the name, image, likeness changes in college sports are impacting the future. We'll talk about gender norms, and there we'll talk to economist Ariel Binder about how the changing gender norms and changing workplace norms are affecting men in particular, but also how we should be thinking about those across genders. We'll talk about consumerism and feminism, and finally we'll come into the media representation and how genders are represented in media and in advertising, and we'll be talking to Latha Sarathi from the ANA See Her project about all the ways we measure that. Another part of foresight projects that Ipsos likes to draw on is a tool developed by my colleague in Strategy 3, Trevor Sudano, called Future Jobs to be Done. And it spins the traditional jobs to be done framework forward with future jobs to be done. And this builds on a theory that people buy products and services to fill certain needs or accomplish specific tasks. For example, we don't buy a taxi ride, we hire one to get us where we want to go. We don't buy body wash, we hire it to bathe and smell good. So to bring that into the future, we envision these powerful and plausible scenarios through strategic foresight. In this case, we developed some that we'll talk about later in the issue just for the WTF gender issue. And these scenarios help us define the circumstances in which many people may find themselves, like a retail store with gendered fitting rooms. For non-binary shoppers, how could retailers update to be more inclusive? And we use future jobs to be done to tie these scenarios to actions that organizations can take to help people meet future needs. While it's typical in Foresight to create a series of these or clusters, we're sharing one scenario here as an example, and my colleague Jennifer Bender in Strategy 3 developed this for the gender issue. So there's a plausible world in which people express their gender more fluidly, and in that world, brands can help by offering safe, gender-expansive places and services. So potential future jobs to be done include, help me find products by promoting benefits rather than gender cues. Help me be myself by using gender-expanded imagery and staff badges. Help me feel safe and included with all gender locker changing rooms. Future jobs to be done is a great tool to help us think about the future and the innovations that will require to get us there. We're going to talk about the future as a lot today, of course, but let's start with a little bit of the present. As Kai Rizdal has taught us, let's do the numbers. For all the drama around gender today, we're talking about a pretty small sliver of the population that identifies as anything other than male or female or trans, or as trans. A large majority of Americans don't even know someone, even as an acquaintance, who is trans or non-binary. Most Americans don't think there is such a thing as a spectrum of gender. Some are quite offended by even discussing the concept. But every one of those small percent of people is a person, and this is an issue that is deeply personal as it gets to one of the cores of human identity. And sexuality and gender are topics that are often intertwined in the socio-political space. Every day now brings the headlines of legislation going on in this space, restricting access to care and bathrooms and outlawing drag shows in parts of the country, which some feel is to protect children and others feel will cause harm to an already challenged group of people. You have your opinions, I have mine. Regardless, the data shows that these are issues that people care about, even if they care for different reasons. So this slide is a selection from an ongoing Ipsos poll we field every other week now as part of our consumer tracker called the Ipsos Care-O-Meter. It looks at how much people know about a topic versus how much they care. And the disconnects are fascinating, as are the comparisons. So people know and care about boycotts. They knew less, but also cared about laws in Texas and Montana that have passed recently restricting gender affirmation care for youth. And digging into the tabs, we see that Democrats tend to care more than Republicans about each of these issues. When it comes to gender equality, a plurality think that we have much more to do, but many think we've already done a significant, but many think we're there already, and a significant minority, for men in the US, even more, think that we've gone much too far. So there are signs that progress on gender equality between men and women is in danger of stalling. For those who think gender equity hasn't gone far enough, and there's a fair amount of data to show that, at least in the workplace, we are not there yet. There's a tension in that 64% think we won't achieve equality until men take an active role, and 53% think men are already doing too much. 48% globally think we've gone too far and that we're discriminating against men. So there's the lay of the land from a data perspective. Again, it's fraught. How can we reduce the tensions in some places and add some needed tensions in others? We talked to some people and we looked at some research and conducted novel research of our own. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time together. When Cameron Kostopoulos, his family learned he was gay, they essentially cut ties. That's a painful journey, and it made him wonder if he could use his skills as a filmmaker to create an experience that would help people understand what it feels like to be someone with a different gender identity. Using the Unreal gaming engine and special hardware for body, face, eye, and hand tracking, he created the award-winning project Body of Mine, an immersive VR experience. I met Cameron at South by Southwest this year, where Body of Mine was on exhibit, though the experience was all booked up and I didn't get to try it out for myself, sadly. Body of Mind uses cutting-edge immersive storytelling tools to create an experience where you literally see yourself in someone else's skin and hear interviews with people with different identities about their experiences. Kostopoulos' goal is to move beyond empathy to understanding, and that wouldn't work in the same way with traditional film. He's not naive. He understands that everyone will take part in something like this, and that not everyone will be moved by it. But he thinks that those who are uncomfortable with the experience might find the experience makes them ultimately more comfortable with their own identity, as well as with other people. I witnessed this at South by Southwest, which was arguably a more sympathetic audience than some, and I asked him how he thought this would go over in the conservative Texas community where he grew up. Here's what he told me.
If I set it up at my hometown and I had an audience that was made up of adults and children and just kind of everyone, oh my goodness, it would not go. There'd be some people who love it, and there would be some people who are so glad they saw it, including a lot of the people that we interviewed are from Texas. So there'd be a lot of people who are really happy. There'd be even more people who are really unhappy. Some scary looking people who would probably give us threats, and probably some higher ups like police officers and people who look official who are not happy about it. It would not go super well, but personally, that is what makes me a little bit excited about it. I think we should make people uncomfortable when they need to be made uncomfortable, and we need to talk about these things.
Okay, so back to it. Here's an example of how fast this is all moving. Last summer, I had a dinner with some of our behavioral sciences team, and we were talking about gender and definitions and noted that it wasn't all that political of a topic yet. Now the discourse around transgender people is divisive. How can we turn down the temperature? Building on prior research, new Ipsos research shows that when people take transgender people's perspective into account, it can nudge into a more accepting attitudes around gender fluidity. I don't often deep dive into the weeds of the methodology, but if you check out the issue on future.ipsos.com, or you can download it from this app, you'll find a detailed look at how we did this, and it's super cool because behavioral science is awesome. But anyway, by using a proprietary tool called non-conscious process tracing, Ipsos measured how much conflict people feel in their opinions about gender. And the study showed that when people with negative views about transgender people were given statements that offered an empathetic view, it created more conflict in their gender beliefs than when they simply read about transgender people's behavior, said Luke Nolan, who is a director in our Ipsos Behavioral Science Center and helped run this project with us. And that's constructive conflict, by the way, the kind that can shift attention, and we'll talk about that more later. But for marketers and policymakers and others who want to change attitude about gender fluidity, using messages that encourage others to put themselves into trans people's perspective may help change their beliefs about gender fluidity more broadly. And we'll talk today about how many younger people view gender differently than older people do. And when we think about generational shifts, it's helpful to think about them in three ways: cohort, life stage, and period. A cohort has different views, and these stay different over time. So in this case, will younger generations always view gender differently from other generations? With life stage, people's attitudes change as they age. So you might have different things go on when you're young and single, or when you're married and have kids, or when you're closing in on retirement. And those attitudes are shifted by those life stages or events. So for example, part of coming of age might become declaring your pronouns for this, and coming generations might develop a ceremony around this. Who knows? And period effects are attitudes of all cohorts changing in a similar way over the same period. So maybe some dramatic event like a world war takes place and shifts everybody kind of all in one direction. And we could wind up with a situation where legislation forces the binary as the legal definition of gender, and the fluidity conversation retreats from public discourse. So if you're doing research on Gen Z and younger people, gender fluidity is a fascinating topic at the moment because we likely won't know for decades which effect we're looking at. And the important part for marketers is to realize that each of these generational responses is possible, and each needs to be considered for planning purposes for next quarter, next year, and further into the future. One change happening for younger Americans is a profound shift in the way college athletes are compensated. In the nearly 2 years since the NCAA adopted new rules allowing college athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness, the floodgates have opened for commercial representation of student athletes, along with the hopes for gender equality in sports. And while the rule shift gives women athletes more opportunity to catch up to their male counterparts, veteran sports agent Erin Kane says it could take a while to close the profitability gap. Already, name, image, likeness has made millionaires out of a slew of college athletes. Kane represents some of the world's top college moneymakers, including University of South Carolina's basketball's Zia Cook and Chloe Kitts. But Kane is unsure how long it could take to close the gender pay gap in sports. Even with this new name, image, likeness playing field, issues of gender representation will persist, especially in how athletes represent themselves on social media and how brands represent them in advertising. This is an issue that's especially fraught for female athletes. Here's what she told our Kate MacArthur.
I just think self-determination at the heart of it is the most important piece. And whatever comes from that, individual, young or older or whatever, individual women don't bear the responsibility for the cultural constructs. It's not their responsibility. And I think it takes time, age, and lots of different things to really understand the big picture even. But for me, really at the heart of it is represent yourself the way you want to represent yourself and express yourself the way you want to express yourself. But I do think that women are we're savvy. We all understand what expressing ourselves certain ways means, what it will get us, what it won't get us. I would take a step back. And I think individual athletes, some of them just want to play their sport. That's men or women. They're not motivated by fame or following or any of those things, but feel that they have to engage with that because it's a means to an end, right? It gives you leverage in contract negotiations and it provides revenue opportunities. I think everybody experiences that pressure. Almost, it's gender agnostic. The one thing I'll say that's different for women and girls is like the level of threats and the threats of violence against them. That is much more difficult to contend with. It's scary.
The decline of younger men in the workforce has led some people to declare a crisis or even a war on men. Remember our data points earlier. And over the decades, fewer men have been getting post-high school education or been part of the workforce. Men are also less likely to be in committed or married relationships, shifting their long-standing role as breadwinners. Why and what comes next is a topic that economist Ariel Binder has long researched, and there is no simple answer. Binder isn't sold on the crisis or war framing, and while the labor force needs to adapt and create more meaningful jobs, he thinks AI will also impact some manual and labor jobs, more typically employing men less severely than other professionals. But he thinks that men have some responsibility to adapt better than they have been to a changing world. Here's what he told me while we chatted.
I'm not sure that I would use kind of crisis framing to think about this. I think that we need to look more into how these men are adjusting their strategies and their time uses due to these big shifts in society that we've seen. And I wouldn't just label men as failing to adjust or being cast off. I think just as we have had this tremendous rise in labor force participation in education over the last several decades and have dynamically responded to opportunities and shifts in the economy, I think men ought to be held to the same kind of narrative, whereas situations have changed, they should be thinking about changing how they spend their time and the types of skills and vocations that they invest in. Despite my having pushed back against the crisis narrative, it is still the case that change is painful, and these are accumulated decades of change that now, as the economy recovers, finds a new mode after the pandemic, and with all the technologies that have arisen that allow for remote work or contactless delivery of services, where men who had previously had flagging employment prospects, where they fit in, and seeding some power in the household or in the labor market to women is difficult, right? And may lead to some of these sort of malaise type of narratives, or men feeling unmoored and unsure of their purpose.
Today, half of American men agree that women won't reach equality unless men take action to support women's rights, according to a recent Ipsos survey. Yet 40% also think that efforts towards gender equality have gone too far or too fast. Notably, just 5 percentage points separates women from men on this opinion. The gap by party identification is more dramatic. It's often said that men can benefit from shifting gender norms, but the data indicates that many men don't see it that way, says Mallory Newell, a vice president in Ipsos's public affairs practice. When it comes to gender equality, brands and businesses need a vision that includes men. After all, they'll play a role in creating that world. And politics have catalyzed a polarizing divide about human rights in the US, turning the debate into a red versus blue issue. However, feminism's histories shows that women have been strongly unified in pursuing the many rights unequally withheld from them. However, as women continue to fight against pay inequality, gender-based healthcare inaccessibility, harmful social norms, and gender-based violence, 1/3 of US women said they don't believe there is inequality between men and women. Moreover, we have entered the fourth wave of feminism, which is defined by intersectionality, as many now recognize the variance and relative disparities of the female experience. In recent years, society has acquired a more progressive understanding of the diversity of gender and the interconnection of gender across race, but research still falls short in reflecting that interconnection. To continue to appeal to or advocate for women to acquire these rights, brands should elevate if and how they seek to understand the gaps in perception across the intersections of women, who all experience inequality to varying degrees daily, says Mercedes Bender, a principal at Ipsos Strategy 3. She says, by treating women as a monolith, brands risk truly understanding their unique relationships with womanhood and connecting with them in resonant ways. Despite the perceptions mentioned earlier, women won't realize gender equality for another 132 to 300 years, depending on who's doing the measuring. It's an economic education and access issue, and it shapes societal perceptions overall, says Latha Sarathi, EVP Analytics and Insights and Measurement at See Her, a division of the Association of National Advertisers. But so can media and marketing. Sarathi says new research signals potential shifts on how media depicts gender and how brands will target and communicate with people in the future. With almost 100,000 marketing and media messages bombarding people daily, Sarathi contends how women are represented in media is not only fundamental to understanding how women are showing up in our society, it can also be a catalyst for change. She says new research reveals that Gen Zs not only more aware of gender fluidity, they're also embraced it more than other generations, which shapes their buying behavior and brand perceptions. And that could affect everything from survey questionnaires to how people are depicted in the media. In What the Future, one of the ways we'd like to think about the future is to think about the tensions that will drive that and impact it. And the fun thing about that is there are things that we can measure today, right? And we can think about how the future will change if some of these trends and some of these tensions start to shift. These tensions are pretty tense in this issue. So let's take a look at a few of them that are really going to make an impact on the future of gender. Tension 1. We're in a period of flux when it comes to gender roles and to an extent, gender identity. As tightly defined gender roles have loosened, it's more incumbent upon content creators and advertisers to depict everyone well, says Latha Sarathi from ANA See Her. Representing everyone will be the key to help people feel included while also helping them learn new norms. She says, thinking about traditional gender identities, we have to be very thoughtful of how we depict men as much as how we depict women. For women, the point is that we still have not leveled the playing field, she says. But for men, how can we nuance their portrayal as well so that there is true equality? And this tension shows that we're not there yet. Tension 2. Empirically, we know that the US has not achieved gender equality, at least in terms of pay, and not in many other aspects of society or the economy. So what does that say that 1 in 3 people overall, including 4 in 10 men, think we have? Or that 18 to 35-year-olds think we've reached equality, more 18 to 34-year-olds think we've reached equality than those over 50? How will that affect efforts to reach that milestone? It would seem that while the 2/3 of people today who say they haven't gotten there might be incentivized to move the needle, 1/3 will be less intentional about that, or perhaps work counter to it if they think we're already there. This is one of the central tensions in this discussion of gender, and how or if its opinion shift will really matter. Many cultures in the world believe that gender is a spectrum. Even in the US, there has historically been fluctuation in our gender norms. Today, almost 2 in 3 think gender is a binary, though almost half of those under 35 think it is a spectrum. For people on that spectrum, mental health can be a struggle as they try to understand themselves while also coping with a lack of understanding from others. Filmmaker and interactive storyteller Cameron Kostopoulos wants tech to move this tension. He says, "I believe that virtual reality can be used as a tool for powerful storytelling and for generating not just empathy, but action and understanding." Tension 4. Would traditional gender roles make the world better or worse? Most people believe in traditional gender roles, but those have been shifting for decades, and today this is more of a 50-50 split for those under 35. Plausibly, the shift will continue, though there is considerable backlash happening right now. Women have reinvented their role, pushing the glass ceiling higher and sometimes breaking through. Men, it can be argued, are not adjusting as well, but they should, argues economist Ariel Binder. Men ought to be held to the same narrative, he says. Situations have changed, and they should be thinking about how they spend their time and skills and vocations they can invest in. Tension 5. Most people think that if people use their sexuality to promote themselves, it limits their value in other ways. And yet, as the saying goes, sex sells. Today, more women are embracing sexy images for self-promotion as an expression of female agency and empowerment. There are likely a lot of gender double standards hiding in this data. But sports agent Erin Kane thinks people should be able to appear on social media or elsewhere without penalty. She says, "I can't fault women for wanting to express themselves the way they want to. That's the #1 principle of self-actualization and realization. And having the freedom to be a woman means defying the cultural constructs or engaging with them in whatever way you choose." As generations who have grown up with social media become a larger share of the population, this tension could likely shift. And finally, tension 6. Does someone else's trans identity affect your values? Fewer than 1% of Americans identify as transgender, according to Ipsos data. A sizable majority, 71%, of Americans don't have an acquaintance, let alone a friend or family member who is trans. And the numbers are even smaller for people who know or identify as non-binary or other forms of gender fluid. Yet a sizable minority think that this tiny percentage of the population is threatening their values, that these numbers are consistent across age ranges. In 2023, you see headlines reflecting this daily. Much of this tension has arisen in the past few years as a reaction to a growing discussion of gender as a spectrum. So what will this tension look like in 5 years or in 10? All of this sets up some radically different plausible futures. Let's look at 2. In the first, we'll imagine it's 2035, and gender identity isn't a phrase that's used much in the US anymore. It's just gender. More people believe that gender is binary, whether or not the laws define it as such. People are either male or female legally and in allowable public discourse. This is a hopeful future for some who find the idea of gender fluidity farcical or even harmful. And it's a woeful scenario to others who, either for themselves or for others, want to live and let live. The acceptance by many and court decisions around gender fluidity, same-sex marriage, women's reproductive rights, and gender equality in the 2010s and early part of the 2020s arguably peaked with the Me Too movement. Back in 2023, Ipsos's global data showed that men were flight risk in their support for gender equality. This led to a swift and powerful recoil with reactions such as dress codes for female legislatures in Missouri and bans on medical care and treatment for transgender people. But other changes have been building for decades, culminating with Supreme Court Dobbs' decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Brands spent the decade hopelessly caught in the middle of polarized workforces and endless consumer boycotts and backlashes. As time progressed, despite polls that these policies were unpopular, legislators continued to pass laws and laws after restricting gender identity and roles. Some states went further than others. The federal government passed some laws too. This largely restricted mobility for a sizable part of the population that found themselves or their friends essentially illegal in many states. A predictable mental health crisis ensued. Legislation is one thing, but social and personal reality are another, and the disparities that ensued did not help the US economy. It didn't help the US geopolitically either, as the nation was largely, but not entirely alone, in moving back toward a more historical view of these issues. There are two critical waypoints for gender, and this is one. Is gender a spectrum or a binary? Today, about 2 in 3 say it is, which is a considerable fall off among younger age groups. The other waypoint or tension of whether or not we have reached gender equality, and a similar number there say that we have not reached gender equality. But say those points shift toward an increased acceptance of gender fluidity. Will that make equality a harder thing to judge and measure? What if more people think we've reached equality? Will that make it harder for people to continue fighting for those who aren't treated equally? In the US, gender issues are never simple. So in port 2, let's imagine again that it's 2035. But in this future, the generational shift we've seen in the data about gender fluidity continues. The young adults of 2020s are now in their 30s. And like same-sex marriage before it, gender fluidity is a concept that is fought and fraught until suddenly it isn't anymore. While the older generations were in power in the early 2020s, laws were passed in conservative states restricting definitions and behavior around gender. But at the same time, the youth were largely reacting with a collective shrug. A small but growing part of the population identified as non-binary or trans, but everyone else decided those individual decisions had no bearing on their own lives, accepted each other, and moved on. As younger generations increased their voting power and share of the population, it turned out this wasn't a cohort effect, but that we were entering a new period of gender theory and practice. As part of going through adolescence, American kids started hosting their own gender reveal parties to announce their authentic identities. New products and services around gender thrived. Brands shifted with the times in the creative, packaging, and messaging. And brands in relevant spaces moved away from gendered products, which simplified research and development and production in many ways. There were growing pains in the workplace and the courtroom, where the generations coexisted. And over the decades, gender identity became less a focus of discourse and polarization, and more one of policy and creating structures to support everyone's identity and equality. Men, especially, were required to adapt and change, which they either did willingly or begrudgingly, but they got there. Those are two plausible futures. But what kind of futures do we want, and do we think we'll get there? These are questions we ask each issue in our future optimism gaps. We say we want gender equality, but we're less likely to think we get it. However, while 51% of people say they want gender to be a spectrum, 59% think that's the future we'll wind up in. When it comes to gender, there's a high level of agreement on the future we want. When it comes to identity, gender identity, there is less so. But in most cases, we think we're going to fall short. Brands and policymakers can help, but we are, regardless of our gender, we all have a role to play. One other thing we agree on, we want this to stop being an issue, but we don't think we'll get to that future either. So where does this all leave us? We've done WTFs on vice, love, food, housing, reality, truth, even the future of Earth. You can see them all at future.ipsos.com. But I have to say, this topic feels more fluid than the rest. The tensions feel tense. And I've said the word fraught a lot today, and with good reason. Hopefully we've given you a pretty thorough lay of the land and of where we are today and some paths we might take in the future. It's a tricky landscape for brands and leaders to navigate, but that's why we do these issues, because we all need to plan for several very plausible futures and very different futures. We'll need to start innovating products and services now to be ready. We'll need to work on our messaging and our creative. we'll need to think about our user experiences and our customer experiences and how those might shift. And to do that, we need to think about the future and the research we'll need to understand it. Because when we think about tomorrow, we ask better questions today. So that's it for this episode of What the Future, Gender. Please stay tuned. Coming up next month is our summer blockbuster double issue, What the Future, Intelligence, which we've lined up some amazing interviews and a ton of data about where AI is today and how it will impact your tomorrow. It's going to be a great issue, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Thanks for coming out. Again, I'm Matt Carmichael, the editor of What the Future. It's been great to have you here with us, and we'll see you all in the future.